All right, so we have 4 different classes of hormones. You can see we have peptides or proteins, monoamines, steroids, and then lipid-based hormones. These first 2, the peptides or peptides, proteins, and monoamines, they are going to function similarly. And really they're very similar to protein-based. So we're going to consider them together and how they function. And then steroids and lipid-based hormones are going to be similar as well in how they function and exert their effects. So we'll talk about those 2 together. So some key things in the peptide, protein, and monoamine hormones, these are water soluble. So they dissolve in the plasma, they travel freely, but this also means that they cannot diffuse through the plasma membrane. They can't get through there. So this means that in order for them to have any kind of effect, the receptor has to be located on the plasma membrane, right? It can't be inside the cell because these can't get across the cell membrane, so the receptor has to be where they can go, right? The hormone will bind to that receptor, and then there's something called a second messenger signaling cascade. These are G proteins. This is actually a very complex sort of cascade of events, which I'm not going to ask you to memorize. But the big thing is that you understand is that there's a multiple step process, and along each step of the process, there's an amplification effect of this hormone. So and we'll see this in the next diagram, basically each step, one thing leads to many other things, and each one of those many things leads to many more things. So you can imagine this big branching root kind of system kind of thing. So the beauty here is that one hormone can have a very large effect due to this signaling cascade amplification system. So again, one receptor can activate many proteins. So that's what you're looking at here. So here, for example, is an example of epinephrine. It is going to, in the very first step, it gets amplified, and then each one of these triangles will go on to amplify once again, and then each one of these kinases, and I don't expect you to memorize this, but just understand each one of these boxes goes on to activate multiple enzymes, and then each one of these will go on to have an effect on many products, right? So imagine if this was totally drawn out, how absolutely massive an effect this one little molecule of epinephrine would have, right? So that's the strength and the importance of these peptide protein monoamines, is they have this large amplification effect, and their receptors are on the cell membrane. So you don't have to actually produce a lot of these hormones for it to have an effect on the body. Now, conversely, steroids and lipid-based hormones, because they are fat-based, these can easily get through the cell membrane, so that phospholipid bilayer. So because these can easily go right through the cell membrane, there's no transporter that's needed. You don't put the receptor right on the cell membrane. Why bother? It doesn't have to be there. You can actually put it inside the cell. So usually these receptors are going to be somewhere near the nucleus, if not on the nucleus itself, because by binding to the receptor, you're going to turn specific genes either on or off. And in doing so, let's say you turn on as a specific gene, you'll produce new mRNA, which creates new proteins, and then these new proteins will then alter the cell's activity in some way. So the benefit of these is that you don't have to have them on the cell membrane. It can go right into the cell and have some effect on the genetic or the expression of certain genes inside that cell. So let's just talk a little bit about how 2 different or several different hormones may interact with one another. You have something called a permissive effect. So what this is one hormone will produce the receptors for a second hormone. So sometimes you need to release one thing. The release of that one hormone will actually cause the insertion of receptors on the cell membrane for a second hormone. So if you didn't produce the first one, those receptors wouldn't be there. And so that even though you might release that second hormone, if you didn't release the first one, the second hormone has no receptor to bind to, so then there is no effect. So this is known as a permissive effect. That very first one will permit the second one to bind and have an effect. There's a synergistic effect, so two hormones acting together will produce an even greater effect. So we saw this with gastrin and histamine so far. And sometimes you may have an antagonistic effect where the two hormones do completely different things. So we see that with insulin and glucagon. Insulin makes sure that sugar or glucose is taken from the bloodstream, put into cells. And glucagon does exactly the opposite. It takes stored glucose and releases it into the bloodstream. So they work in opposition to one another, but through their work, we maintain homeostasis. We'll also see this difference. I think we talked a little bit about this already. If not, we will in a few slides. The same thing with calcium regulation of parathyroid hormone, releasing calcium into the bloodstream, versus calcitonin, which puts calcium from the bloodstream into bones. And we'll talk a little bit, we won't touch too much on permissive effects. One classic one is the activity of progesterone and estrogen in the female body, so that they work together to help with this idea of the first hormone has to have the second hormone, or the first hormone brings about the conditions so that a second hormone can be effective. So you can regulate how much hormone is being secreted, either a neuronal regulation. So some things will stimulate the release of hormones via stimulation from the nervous system. Again, hormonal, being that one hormone will cause the release of another hormone, or simply humoral, meaning that concentrations of certain things in the bloodstream will bring about the release of a hormone. So we saw that one, like for example, in the kidneys, where solute concentrations may cause the release of renin, for example, right? Most of the hormones are under a negative feedback control system, meaning that you release a certain amount of the hormone and it feeds back in to decrease its levels of production. So, for example, you may be producing, hormone A. At some point, the concentration of hormone A becomes so great that you don't need any more of it. It's not because you don't want just hormone A. You only want it at a certain level. So it feeds back and stops its own production until the levels drop to a point where you then need to produce more. You produce more, it gets again to a certain level, you now have enough. It feeds back to shut down its own production again until levels drop to where you need to produce more, and so on and so on and so forth. A positive feedback control is where a hormone, the very existence of the hormone causes more of that hormone to be produced. Oxytocin is your classic example. We'll talk quite a bit about this, especially when we get to the reproductive and development systems. But basically, oxytocin is the hormone that is responsible for uterine contractions. And the more uterine contractions there are, it will produce more oxytocin, which produces more uterine contractions, which produces more oxytocin, and so on and so on and so forth. So as in that increase in oxytocin, it causes ever stronger contractions, which are going to be very important to expel the baby from the body. So again, that's a positive feedback loop that only gets shut down once there is no more baby there to push out, and then that cycle gets disrupted. We'll talk more specifically about that in another lecture or so. And this last bullet point here. There are lots of things that can go wrong with hormones because, gosh, they get so complicated between just how they're being secreted or not secreted, receptors, not having receptors, how one hormone interferes with another hormone or influences another hormone. So it's not unheard of to have certain disorders of hormone levels. And this is the most generic thing I could ever say to you, but a hormone disorder is either caused by too much of it being secreted, hypersecretion, or too little of it being secreted, hyposecretion, one or the other. So anyway, and again, we won't get into too many disorders. We'll get into a few toward the very end, but you'll see that it's either one of these two things that causes some physiological problems to occur. All right, before we get into specific endocrine glands, I'm going to stop there. And if you have any questions, please let me know.